Today's event features Melanie Abrams for her novel Meadowlark and Andrew Altschul for his novel The Gringa. For any purchases of these novels that you make this week, both the authors, Oscar and I, will be making a matching donation to the National Bail Fund Network's Emergency Response Fund to support the Black Lives Matter protests and the COVID-19 Emergency Response Fund for community bail and bond funds. You don't have to do anything else, just order the books from Booksmith, and I'll include the link for that fund if you want to make a direct donation yourself. If you have any questions for today's authors, please feel free to add them in the comments and we'll pass them on. I'm going to turn things over now to Ziziva's managing editor, Oscar Villalone, who will serve as today's MC. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you, Evan. I am Oscar Villalone. I'm the managing editor of Ziziva, and I'm going to right now introduce our two readers. And let's go. Melanie Abrams is the author of the novels Plane and most recently Meadowlark, which was named one of the most anticipated crime books of 2020 by LitHub's Crime Reads. Kirkus says of Meadowlark that it gorgeously depicts the spellbinding world of closed communities in which being noticed special means everything, and calls the novel a compelling taut portrait of love and broken promises. And Booklist says of Meadowlark that it is a beautifully written, if terrifying, look at childhood trauma and how being extraordinary does not promise a charmed life. Melanie Abrams teaches writing at UC Berkeley and is married to author Vikram Chandra. They live with their children in Oakland. Welcome, Melanie.
Hi.
And our other guest today is Andrew Altschul. He's the author of the novels Lady Lazarus, Deux Ex Machina, and most recently, The Gringa. In its starred review, Booklist said, The Gringa challenges the boundaries between activism and insurrection, fiction, and reality, and that Altschul's ambitious and culturally aware novel is a captivating depiction of passion, disenchantment, and hope gone violently awry. Publishers Weekly called the novel rousing and complex, a postmodern Cervantes-like labyrinth. Andrew is a contributing editor at Ziziva and directs the creative writing program at Colorado State University. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Oscar. Good to be here.
And before Andrew and Melanie begin their conversation, they will both give readings from their books. I will be popping back later in to moderate, basically to field your questions that you could type in right there on your Facebook and this during this Facebook Live presentation. And also a reminder again, you can find not only the books by Melanie and Andrew, but all the books by all the authors participating in Lockdown Lit at the Booksmith's website. All right, guys, take it away.
All right. I think I'm going to go first and tell you a little bit about Meadowlark and then give you a little reading because it's always difficult to summarize your book when you are live. I'm going to read a little bit about what it's about, and then I'll give you a little insight about the backstory of what I'm going to read, and then I'll go ahead and read. Okay. So Meadowlark. So as teenagers, Simran and Arjun escape a strict spiritual compound. They go their separate ways, but reconnect in the present of the novel when Simran learns Arjun has become the charismatic leader of his own commune, Meadowlark. In spite of their fractured relationship, Simran, now a photojournalist, agrees to visit Meadowlark to document its story, only to realize that the commune is in the midst of a criminal investigation and there's something disturbing about Arjun's beliefs concerning children and their unusual abilities. All right. So I'm reading a little bit from the backstory of the book. Simran and Arjun, like I said, grow up on this Eastern-leaning compound. And so this is when they're little, and they're just, they're about 14, 15, and they're contemplating running away. A week later, Simran broached the topic of their exodus. There was a group of them, not only Jayashri, Arjun, and Simran, but Priya and Sachi, Krish, and Gautam, huddled under the blanket of night, hiding half a bottle of vodka. There was no drinking at Ananda, but Priya had delved into a flirtation with a townie, and he had presented it as an offering. They took big gulps from the bottle, then cursed and spit into the desert sand. Jesus Christ, Gautam said. What the fuck is this made of? Just drink it, Priya said. None of them but Priya had ever had alcohol before, and Priya only last week at lunch behind the bleachers. Simran felt the warm rush of it pulse through her body. I'm hot, she said, and took off her sweater. That's the booze, Priya said. The resident expert, Arjun said. Says the golden one. Priya reached over and socked him in the shoulder, and Simran felt the familiar urge to move closer to Arjun. If the shoe fits, he said and closed his eyes. Of course he doesn't deny it, Priya said and took another slug. Okay, Mahatma. This talk of Arjun as divine always made Simran nervous. Last week she had heard whispers of what would happen if the group seceded again. And the next day there was a mandatory forum on the dangers of elevating men to the height of gods. Yesterday, flowers had shown up in Arjun's shoes, and today's forum had been about the benefits of sex segregation during darshan. Simran rarely listened, had become expert at scrapbooking photos in her head instead, but that day she had fixed on what Lakshman had said. Men and women, boys and girls, need to consider the impact the opposite sex has on their consciousness, especially boys and girls, who may need some assistance in the matter. In previous days, it might not have sounded so ominous, but with everything changing so quickly, with her own mother choosing to cover her head, just during worship, she had said when Simran questioned her, I'm not some browbeaten housewife. And others choosing silence during what had once been happily communal mealtimes, Simran heard the threat under the platitude. Leave him alone, Simran said. Priya sighed loudly and rolled onto her stomach. Krish, give me a massage. Please, said Krish. Please. Simran lay on her back and looked at the stars, and Jayashree cuddled up next to her and put her head on Simran's stomach. Let's stay here forever, Jayashree said. Simran ran her fingers through Jayashree's hair. Or never go back, she said. She had meant it like Jayashree had. Oh, the stars. Oh, this moment. But as soon as she said it, she felt the resonance of the statement. Arjun turned and they locked eyes. I wish, Jayashree said. No, you don't, said Sachi, the resident follower of rules. Yes, I do. She was too loud, and Simran clamped her hand over Jayashree's mouth. They had made Sachi drink, one tiny sip, collateral against her tattling, but threatening to run away was something else. There had only been one runaway since Ananda had formed, a legendary boy named Adi, who sneaked away one night and was rumored to have been found dead the next morning. No one spoke directly about it, but the story passed between the kids was that he had either been hit by a train, killed while hitchhiking, or been the recipient of so much focused prayer that he had simply imploded. There was no distinct punishment for threatening to run away, but the unspoken warning lay beneath every swallowed threat. Once you leave, you can never come back. Sure, some kids went to college, many moved off-site, and some even moved out of state, but they kept the pretense. I meditate before class. I've even taught my roommate. We've made the walk-in closet a prayer room. But choosing to leave Ananda without the blessing of the community, without a clear plan on how to continue your path out of samsara, that was unthinkable. And lately, the community seemed harder to convince. Jyoti's daughter had visited last month and been peppered with very specific questions about which mantra she was chanting and why. And Jason, Rupa, and Dinesh's son, who had stopped using his Ananda name so long ago that Simran couldn't even remember it, came to visit and was asked to leave. Rupa had stood in reception trying to hide her tears while Dinesh stared at his feet and quietly insisted Jason go. After he left, Rupa and Dinesh had been given hugs and blessings, and a rice and turmeric mala appeared on their doorstep. There was no shame in having a defective family member. It was their karma to answer to. But one did not invite that karma to stay, even if said karma had been visiting once a month for years. So running away, clearly saying namaste to everything Ananda stood for, was something one did not bring up without serious fear. The amount of silent karmic yoga that would be doled out for this crime seemed unimaginable. Simran looked at Arjun, who had propped himself up on his elbow. Jayashree, he said, come get water with me. They had always been protective of Jayashree, who was tiny for her age and seemingly incapable of understanding subtlety. Jayashree lifted herself and stumbled, and Arjun caught her by the elbow. Simran watched her lean against him, their figures illuminated in the moonlight. The next day, as they walked to school, hungover and spent, Arjun had held her back. Did you mean it? He asked. She waited a breath, knowing that things would be forever changed as soon as she spoke. Yes. He looked at her hard and long. When? She didn't know the answer, thought this was the moment where he, like always, would take charge. I don't know. Think about it, he said. And so she did. Ananda was becoming more and more restrictive, but it wasn't that long until she was 18 and they could all get the fuck out and then fake their way into visits if they wanted. And even if gender segregation was implemented, it would just be for meditation. Who cared about that? But then the talk of Arjun's divinity reached its crescendo. 4-year-old Kavya almost drowned, and despite the fact that there were 5 of them there to pull her from the swollen river, Arjun had been the one who had seen her topple off the rocks and carried her back to Ananda. There were rumors that Kavya had actually died, and Arjun brought her back to life by laying his hands on her head. That Arjun's skin seemed to be taking on a bluish tint. That Ananda would be foolish not to accept a guru that showed himself so certainly. The whispers of seceding were no longer whispers. That's it.
Well, thank you so much, Melanie. I love that. I love that passage from the book, and the way that it just shows, like, no matter what the context you put people in, there's certain kinds of dynamics interpersonally, especially with teenagers, that are just going to come through. And I think that's something that we thought we might talk about later during the conversation, but I was really excited that you chose that passage to read. Thanks.
Thanks.
So I'm going to read an excerpt from the Gringa, which came out in March. And the novel is based on a true story, and it tells the story of Leonora Gelb, who's like a fairly privileged American activist who gets arrested in Lima, Peru in the late 90s, living in a safe house with half a dozen leftist militants, and she's convicted and sentenced to life in a military prison as a terrorist. I was going to read a section from the beginning, which is kind of my standard reading, but given all the things that are happening in the world right now, I thought I'd read a section from somewhere in the middle that is a section dealing with protest and privilege and race and violence, and it felt like it spoke directly to this moment that we're living through. So this is a passage of backstory about Leonora's life before she moves to Peru. This takes place during her senior year at Stanford University, and it is the day of the first Gulf War begins, the day of the U.S. invasion of Kuwait to eject Iraqi forces. And the only other character in this section that you need to know about is a man named Martin, who Leonora is sort of dating on again, off again, and he's a grad student who lives in Berkeley in a house full of what appears to be a kind of neo-Black Panther cell. In San Francisco's crowded Civic Center, she followed Martin through a crowd of thousands, a surly and liquid mass that swelled and shifted, insinuating itself between buildings, swamping police lines, thumping drums and clanging pots and pans in an endless rattle that set the nerves on edge. The weather had cleared, the sky packed with fist-shaped clouds that wheeled around City Hall's gold dome. Speakers shouted into bullhorns, cursing President Bush and the oil companies. Signs stabbed the air. Stop the madness. Fags against war. An eye for an eye equals justice, does not equal justice, excuse me. As waves of outrage rolled through the plaza in deep orgasmic shudders. She hadn't eaten. Hunger and the buzz of coffee brought a sweat to her hairline. Unshowered under her long-sleeve shirt, she could smell her own slightly horsey scent mixed with his sharp musk. She was supposed to be in the library, working on an art history paper. While the bombs fell, while innocent people were maimed and incinerated, she was supposed to write a paper on Caravaggio. Unthinkable. She knew this was how most people lived, by somehow finding ways to write papers on Caravaggio while children in other countries were murdered, but Leonora would not be like most people. If you're doing this, you gotta be ready, Martin said at dawn. He told her to wear black, to take off her rings, leave her ID at home. They'd taken the train from Palo Alto, and Leo practiced glaring at well-dressed commuters until they turned away. As the sun moved behind the stately buildings, the undertow shifted toward Market Street and the financial district. The crowd was still growing, fed by side streets, a cacophony of car horns met by angry howls. Leo's pulse banged in her head. Cops in riot gear lined the sidewalks, cries of pig and fascist, followed by the crack of glass bottles against plastic shields, metal thuds as bodies were thrown against the hoods of cars. Martin pulled her through the current and into a courtyard where a dozen men and women clustered nervously. A pink-faced teenager with a shaved head and full-sleeve tattoos handed out ski masks. Leo clutched hers in both hands and looked at Martin. "You can still go home," he said. "Vámonos," the tattooed kid said. As they neared Powell Street, the crowd barely moving, Leo kept her eyes on Martin's back. Into her head came a litany of things she needed to do, the Caravaggio paper, another on Plath and Sexton. It was her turn to clean the co-op kitchen. Her father's birthday was next week and she still hadn't bought him a gift. Her stomach hardened into a hot nut. Children were going to die for no reason, she reminded herself. What did Renaissance art matter? A few feet away, a naked woman painted with blue and orange flames hurled herself at a policeman. "You fucking murderers! You fucking baby killers!" she cried. The cop barely got his shield up in time. 3 others grabbed the woman's flailing limbs, and she growled deep in her throat and spat at one cop's face mask, and he pulled a canister from his belt and sprayed her in the eyes. Leo felt herself duck, felt something whiz overhead, and then a great shattering as the window of a shoe store evaporated. Her mind whirled. This was the real thing, not a lecture or a photograph. She looked up at the surrounding office buildings where tiny faces watched the melee from dozens of windows. "Wait," Leo said, snatching at Martin's sleeve. He shrugged her off. The air was suddenly bitter with smoke. "Where are we going?" she said. But he was already forging ahead. Someone handed her a length of heavy pipe, and then they were pushed apart by a riptide of bodies in skin-tight skeleton suits who rushed across the street, leaping onto cars and barreled full force into the police line. At the next intersection, the Chevron building soared skyward out of a cloud of white smoke like the space shuttle on its launch pad. Its gilded revolving doors were guarded by an arc of police cruisers and orange water barrels, beyond which was mayhem, cops and protesters colliding, spinning in pairs as if it were a lurid high school dance. She couldn't find Martin, couldn't breathe through the smell of gasoline. The pipe hung heavy at her side. A surge in the crowd knocked her off balance, and when she righted herself, they were sprinting past, a dozen bodies in black masks, smashing into the cops with loud grunts and the clamor of metal on pavement, and then she was running after them, struggling to get closer to those golden doors. She could hear herself screaming. She stumbled and went down, and a pile of bodies fell on top of her and rolled and quickly scattered. As she climbed to her feet, a skeleton suit barreled into her, and she shoved him back with an animal cry and shook herself free. Step by step, she pushed forward, dazzled by flames, until she was only a dozen yards from the revolving doors. When the smoke briefly cleared, she saw a body on the ground set upon by 5 cops, one of whom tore off the attacker's mask, while the rest slammed nightsticks at his limbs, drove the butts into his belly, kicked at his ribs. She couldn't move. The sirens wailed, and the man on the ground curled up and rolled side to side, but she couldn't make herself move forward. And when the cop holding the mask took a running step and aimed his boot at Martin's head, Leo dropped the pipe she was still holding and ran. Eyes streaming, she elbowed across the current, stumbled on bottles and bricks, and tripped at the curb, tearing the flesh from her palms as she fell. She dodged through a gap in the police line and headed away from Market Street, at each intersection turning from smoke and noise into the eerie stillness of downtown. She stopped on a dark corner to pull off the mask and retch hot mucus into a trash can. A fire engine screamed past, and she started to run again. In Union Square, there were cops everywhere, lining every sidewalk. She wiped her nose, spat in the gutter, and ducked into the first set of doors to stand blinking and heaving in the crystal white light of Macy's perfume department. Later that night, the war would begin. Baghdad lit up with tracer fire, glowing submarine green on CNN, the silent and unreal world of alien life forms doomed to extinction. There would be tomcats and prowlers, hellfire and scuds, bombs that found their targets and bombs that found something else. There would be stories about US arms sold to Saddam, doctored satellite photos, PR firms paid to invent Iraqi atrocities. And through it all, you could hear the chatter of Wolf Blitzer and Bernie Shaw, the stern compassion of Tom Brokaw, and the bland assurances of the president, who that first night explained to us, there are things worth fighting for. But in this moment, there was only the chilly light of the showroom, the tick and buzz of fluorescents, the whispers of other customers when they caught sight of the girl in black with a livid face and bleeding hands. "Is there something I can help you with?" A skinny saleswoman stood flanked by 2 coworkers. They closed ranks at the Chanel counter, trying to maintain their staged elegance like figures in a Nagel sketch that someone is about to burn. Leah was shaky-kneed, her blood pounding. Police cars wailed past on Stockton Street, blue light fracturing across the mirrored counters. I'm okay, she said. I'm sorry, said the saleswoman, but you'll have to leave. Leah forced her breathing to slow. I'm looking for the men's department, she said. The woman folded her arms. Willing her hand not to shake, Leah took her Stanford Visa card from her pocket and summoned a voice learned in the shopping malls of her youth. I'm here to buy a birthday present for my father. Is there a problem? Before they could reply, she spotted the escalator and strode past the women with chin high. She rode up 3 flights, swallowing ripples of sobs, washed her face in the ladies' room and browsed a good long time until her eyes dried, her limbs stopped shaking, until she found the perfect gift, a silk tie, an abstract blaze of blue and red, designed, the label said, by Jerry Garcia.
Such a great passage. I'm so glad you read that.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it seemed, almost too on the nose. I mean, it just kind of reminds me of this moment we're living through in lots of different ways. So we, this event has been postponed a couple of times because all the things going on in the world, and it seems like a couple months ago, Melanie, that you and I talked about what we might talk about today. But just before launching in, I want to thank the Booksmith, and I want to thank Ziziba for helping to put on this event. And I want to remind everybody that, that today's event is a benefit. If you go to booksmith.com and buy either of our books, Meadowlark or the Gringa, anytime between now and a week from now, next Tuesday, the 4 of us, Oscar and Evan and Melanie and I, are each going to make a donation to the National Bail Fund Network's Emergency Response Fund to support protesters who've been arrested in the past couple of weeks, and also to contribute to bail funds to help get people out of jail during a global pandemic where their health is truly endangered by sitting in jail if they can't afford to make bail. So please do consider buying one or both of these books today or sometime this week. So we were talking about the ways that our novels are so different, Melanie, but we each worked on them for a really long time. They each required, really a major rethinking of how we approach books, of what it is that we wanted to accomplish in our books. Well, could you talk a little bit for you about where the first ideas for Meadowlark came from, and maybe how you sort of navigated the beginning of that process of turning it into this wonderful novel?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I kind of came at it from, I'm sure there was more than 2 places, but 2 prominent places. And one was kind of photography. Like, I've always been interested in photography, and particularly portraiture. And it seems like the impetus or the genesis of this novel started decades ago in a way. I first encountered Sally Mann, who is this incredible portraiture. She does other stuff as well, but particularly she takes a lot of pictures of her family, and they're very provocative pictures, slightly edgy, and something I've always been interested in with my own writing. But I think what was interesting to me about her photography was that she was able to look at children in a way that was both actually provocative and slightly uncomfortable, but really real. I think that a lot of the times we have this idealized version of kids. And so these pictures were like a way in to see that, children are dynamic beings with all kinds of complicated feelings. And I was just fascinated by that. Like, what would happen if you looked at kids in a way that was super nuanced and slightly uncomfortable? So I kind of had that. And then I also had this idea that I've just always been fascinated by any kind of cultish communities, like whether they're communes or straight up cults, or anything that's in kind of that alternative community. And it started around the same time that I started finding the Sally Mann photography, which was way long ago when I lived in North Carolina. And I think my first kind of introduction into these cultish communities was with fundamentalist and evangelical Christianity in the South. And just this idea that I kind of befriended some people who were involved in this very evangelical fundamentalist church, and was able to kind of go in and see what was happening in the churches and with these people. And I was just fascinated by this idea that you could believe something so incredibly strongly, and some dogma that you subscribed your life to without any kind of either questioning, but also without that there could be any other way to go about living life. Like that was the one way, and that was it. And then from there, I think it's evolved over time to Waco looking into Waco and how that occurred, and it grew from there. So I think that those two pieces were kind of how I found my way into the book. Mm-hmm. And you, Andrew?
Yeah, well, I mean, just even before I talk about the Gringa, like, especially what you're saying about kids. I mean, you have two young kids. I have a 5-year-old, and I mean, anyone who spends any time with them knows like the emotions are, if anything, more complex and more sort of unpredictable than those of adults. But it's true. You read so few books that really take children seriously as these complex emotional beings, and that was one of the things I really admired about Meadowlark. Some of the passages from the point of view of one of the, I guess she's older, Juniper. How old is she? Maybe 11 or 12?
11. Yeah.
Who's living in this alternative community in the Nevada desert, are really just so nuanced and kind of sort of mesmerizing in that watching a car crash kind of way.
Right. And I think just to add to that, just this idea that, to bring the cult piece into the kid piece, like for Juniper also particularly, like she's trying to figure it all out. Like, this set of beliefs that her father and the people she lives with have presented to her, when she realizes that there's something not quite right here. And so that kind of complexity was interesting to me too, to have an indication that there was something wrong, but not knowing exactly what that thing was. I think, kids know that no matter if they're living in a cult, a commune, or, whatever, in a family dynamic unit.
Right, and she's getting to the age where she can start to think for herself. But it strikes me as you're talking about it that you talked about how the sort of environment, the mental and psychological environment of these alternative communities is often a sort of unquestioning belief in a certain ideology or a certain theology or whatever it might be. And it just strikes me like that. How closely that's related to the way that children sort of they understand the world as often as their parents present it to them, unquestioning, until they get to this point where suddenly they say, maybe mom and dad aren't exactly right about everything, and that's just where we find Juniper, and at this moment where everything's become so unstable for the Meadowlark group.
Well, and also what happens with Leo, right? I mean, where she's raised,
Yeah. So, right. I mean, maybe I'll circle back to that in a minute, but most of the novel takes place in Lima, Peru, in the mid and late 90s, where she slowly gets herself wrapped up with this group of leftist militants. This is in the decade, the years just after Peru's dirty war against the Shining Path, which ended in 1992 after about 70,000 people had died in the preceding decade. And there were sort of scattered groups of militants who were not really ready to accept that the war was over. And through a kind of series of events, little by little, Leonora finds herself living in a house that she's renting in a fairly well-to-do suburb of Lima, and it does become exactly this kind of closed community where there's a set of ideas and a set of goals that must be accepted unquestioningly. And so a lot of the novel deals with some of the same things that Meadowlark deals with. I mean, what are the interpersonal dynamics in these closed systems? And what are the ways that an individual subject has to kind of reconcile the messages that they're expected to internalize with the evidence of the real world that they may see from day to day. As far as where the novel came from, I mean, like you, it was kind of decades in the making, even before I started writing it. I started writing it in 2011 or maybe early 2012, right after my second novel had come out. But my interest in the topic really goes back to the late 90s when I was living in Peru, in a small city called Cusco. And this was a couple of years after an American woman named Lori Berenson had been arrested and tried in a military court and sentenced to life in prison for treason and collaboration with terrorists. She was living in a wealthy suburb with members of a group called the Movimiento Revolucionario de Tupac Amaru, the MRTA. And this was very much in the news when I was living in Peru. Even though it was a couple of years old, there was still like ongoing controversies about it, and there was eventually a civilian retrial. And every time that she came back into the news, the reactions of the people around me, and it didn't matter whether they were rich or poor, whether they considered themselves kind of leftist or conservatives, or what their position on the war had been, but everybody reacted so violently to this woman. I mean, in a lot of ways, she was really the most hated person in Peru. This, at that point, 27, 28-year-old American MIT dropout who had clearly gotten mixed up in something a lot bigger than she expected or that she understood. And what really fascinated me about the story was the kind of preposterousness of the ways it was being portrayed. On the one side, you had the Peruvian government and the military prosecutors who from the very beginning referred to her as this like terrorist mastermind. She was this like American soldier of fortune who was going to single-handedly restart the war in Peru and, rain bloodshed upon the populace and bring back the bad old days of the Shining Path. And on the other hand, Berenson's story herself was that she had no idea who these people in the house were. They were these random roommates. She had no idea that they were members of any kind of leftist revolutionary group. I mean, she knew they weren't terrorists, but other than that, she had no idea who they were, wasn't wrapped up in anything they were doing, had no part in anything they were planning. And so both of these stories seemed like completely one-dimensional and ridiculous. And just as a writer, it's habitual to kind of think your way deeper into official stories and try to figure out what might have really happened there. And over the following decade, I followed the story pretty carefully until she was paroled in 2010. And I really never, nobody was ever really successfully able to get deeper into the story and figure out what might really have happened, what she might really have been doing, living in this house for almost a year, what the group might really have been planning versus what the government had said they were planning. And so after a while, it just so fascinated me that I decided I would try to write my own version of it to try to create something more plausible that might bring both the historical events and the kind of more abstract themes into the novel. And so that's how I got started. And then 8 years later, I finally finished.
It's interesting. I think you're, like you said, all writers are interested in nuance and complexity, but I think both of our books, particularly are looking at people that you could corner into, the bad guy or the good guy, cult leaders, people who join a cult. And that's one thing particular that I was so impressed with Leo, is that you're able to do this thing where we're able to see her in this complicated way, just as a revolutionary, but as a human and as someone who grew up in the States, someone who's like not 100% certain what she's doing, trying to figure it out. And that was just like so impressive to me. I mean, that's the kind of fiction I like, taking these complicated people and trying to understand how they became that way. So like, hats off.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons the book took so long to write. I mean, 8 years is a really unpleasant time to be stuck in one project. But yeah, trying to get this character right. I mean, trying to both think of her as a three-dimensional character who, on the one hand is this very committed political person, but is also, a 26, 27-year-old woman who comes from a certain background, has certain family relationships, certain obligations. I mean, none of that is ever involved in any of our discussions of political activists, or what we call radicals, or even what we call terrorists, right? I mean, we always just talk about, you know, what their political goals are, but every single one of these people is a human being, and kind of digging down into who she might be and what might have led her to that place was very difficult. I eventually had to kind of create another narrator to sort of to enact these struggles of figuring her out. This other expat character who's sort of a you know, a very typical or even stereotypical kind of American expat, layabout, hedonist, failed novelist, who really just wants to kind of have a good time in this developing country where his dollar goes quite a long way towards buying him a new identity. But he gets roped into telling this story, and eventually comes to understand like how important it is to understand who she was. And so his efforts to try to figure her out really comprise a certain amount of the novel's drama. By the same token, I mean, I'll throw it back at you, Melanie, and you know, thinking about someone like Arjun, who is, you know, we saw him as a teenager in the excerpt that you read, but for most of the novel, he's the grown leader of his own, let's call it, alternate community. He's married. He has 3 children. He's a very, very complicated man. And, you know, like the terrorist, I mean, the cult leader, you know, whether it's David Koresh or whether it's Jim Jones, I mean, this isn't someone who, you know, pop culture is inclined to think of as a 3-dimensional complex figure. So, I mean, how did you go about thinking your way into who he was, but also maybe kind of resisting whatever your own feelings or reactions to a person like this might have been?
Right. It's such a good question. You know, it's funny, he evolved quite a bit. And actually, you know, obviously I did multiple drafts before showing it to my agent, but even when I showed it to my agent, she was pointed out, he's still at pretty late in the process was, I would not say one-dimensional, but I think I had, you know, I had portrayed him and had a little bit of a kind of a love affair with him in a sense. Like he was this kind of golden child. And it's funny because when I did a conversation with Julia Shears, and she actually said the same thing. She's like, I kind of found myself a little bit in love with him. And you can't do that if you're really going to look at someone. I mean, I'm curious to see if you had that as well. If like, even for Leo, if it was like idealistic and you ended up kind of going in that direction too much and had to pull her back. But for me, I had to think about, you know, I'm really interested in how trauma affects the adults we become, like childhood trauma affects the adults we become. So I really had to think about how, you know, how he was raised would complicate him as a human, and in both good ways and bad ways. And so I kind of tried to, you know, go forward on that path, and just kind of trace his journey to see who he might become. There's this great, Stanislavski quote about method acting, which is, you know, you don't have to imagine, if you can imagine yourself in your character's situation and act accordingly, that is probably the most truthful depiction of a character. So I kind of tried to do that. Like, what happens if I, you know, was raised in this, you know, Eastern leaning cult / alternative community? Who would I become?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you had Julia Shears as one of your readers. I mean, it's hard to think of someone who would be a better reader,
right,
for a book like this. What kind of research did you have to do? I mean, I know because we talked about it just over the phone. This is these communities, Meadowlark, and the community that they were raised in, Ananda, which is a more sort of authoritative, maybe even stereotypical kind of cult environment. But I know that you yourself were not raised in or around one of these communities, and so there must have been a fairly deep dive you had to do in order to really understand what life is like inside a place like this.
Yeah, I kind of took through 2 directions. Like, one was I read and watched everything I could get my hands on in cults or communes and alternative communities. But and a lot of the stuff that you're able to find, documentaries and novels and, nonfiction, it's pretty extreme. I mean, that's the stuff that kind of rises to the top, these cataclysmic, events like Waco, or Children of God, where there's like horrific child abuse going on. So I definitely went down that road. But I felt like if I only stayed, if that was the only kind of research that I was doing, again, you'd end up with not very nuanced way of looking at these people. So I did I did a good amount of research of my own. And I mean, I happen to be in Northern California, which is, like the nexus of alternative communities, right? So I was able to talk to quite a few people that were raised, not necessarily in cults, but on either communes or in slightly alternative communities. And that was really fascinating too, because I expected a lot more kind of looking back critically and unhappiness and that kind of thing. And that's not what I found at all. I found that a lot of people who were raised in these commune-like environments actually had a lot of fond memories, and those places had impacted them in ways that were mostly positive. So, which was surprising to me. So kind of trying to integrate both of those into, so that we have hopefully this nuanced portrait of what it's like to grow up in a place like this and what it's like to just be a member of a place like this.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's always so important. I mean, step one is really kind of discarding a lot of the more available narratives about things like this. I remember reading there's a great book called Shoes Outside the Door. Have you read that, about the San Francisco Zen
Yes.
Center and its origins, and also kind of what was going on, behind the scenes, that was a lot different than the kind of outward face that the public saw. And people forget that, before Jonestown, Jim Jones was like a very public and very well-known government official in San Francisco, right? I mean, I think he was the city housing commissioner for a long time. And he had all these relationships with, very mainstream politicians. And so digging for that stuff is really pretty fascinating. I want to pause for just 1 second and remind everyone that Meadowlark and the Gringa are both for sale at booksmith.com. And everyone who buys a copy of either book anytime from today until next Tuesday, we're going to make a $40 donation to the National Bail Fund Network's Emergency Response Fund to support the protesters who are out fighting for Black lives. So I encourage you all to shell out for one or both of these books. And I also want to remind you that questions for me and Melanie are welcome. You can type them into the Facebook chat, and we'll try to address them as we go. But we were talking about research and
now, Andrew, you definitely have to answer this question, because it's the one that I am most interested, not the most interested, but I've been fascinated because, I mean, your book is so historically driven. I'm kind of curious when you decided to bend facts and when you decided to keep them kind of solid, but more so this idea of how did you write a fictional account while keeping all this historically accurate information in there? Like, how did you decide when to pull back on giving information? How did you decide how much we needed? I mean, it's basically in a way like writing fiction and nonfiction at the same time. And I'm just like so impressed with your ability to do that.
Thank you. I mean, I'll refer you back to my previous answer about it taking 8 years. And that was another one of the reasons. And, of course, there were drafts that were, 40% longer than the finished book, because with any research heavy writing project, even if it's nonfiction, I mean, you fall into that research trap where the more you learn, the more you feel like you need to find a place for in the book. And it was certainly a struggle to keep the book from feeling bloated or from feeling like some kind of a history class or encyclopedia of contemporary Peru. And so a lot of that had to be cut down or told by inference or just to serve as backdrop rather than getting into it explicitly. But I also wanted to get into it explicitly. I mean, I wanted to, in some ways, challenge that conventional wisdom that writers hear so often especially from people in the publishing world and also in workshops and whatnot, you know, that history and politics really don't have a place in contemporary writing. I mean, I think American literary culture must be the only place in the world where writers are told that, and as a result, American literary culture, at least white American literary culture, is kind of shamefully uninterested a lot of the time in history and politics and in these larger forces that really affect our lives, you know, every day. So it was really important to me to get as much of that in as I could. Like I said, I spent a couple of years living in Peru in the late 90s, not specifically to do research, but I learned a lot then. And when I started writing this book in the early 2010s, I mean, first of all, of course, I read everything I could, not only about Peruvian history, but about modern revolutionary history, about Nicaragua, about Cuba, about Chile and Argentina, just to figure out kind of the dynamics and the way that individual lives intersected with these larger national traumas. But I also went back to Peru 4 or 5 times. I mean, I still have a lot of friends and contacts down there, and I was very lucky to be introduced to many, many more. And I just talked to as many people as I possibly could. I mean, I think I logged somewhere around 60 or 70 hours of taped interviews. I talked to journalists, I talked to activists, I talked to former student group leaders. I talked to people who had been sort of wrapped up in radical cells during the Dirty War. I talked to military veterans. I talked to human rights lawyers. I just wanted to get as full a picture as I could of what had happened during the war and what Peru was like in the years afterwards. I mean, I was very conscious the whole time of being this white American for whom Spanish is my second language, who hadn't lived in the country during the war, and feeling like to try to write a novel that presented any kind of coherent or unified version of that history would be sort of unreliable and fraudulent at best, but really a kind of speaking for others or a cultural appropriation that I wasn't willing to engage in. And so I wanted the book to be kaleidoscopic in that way, to really find a place for as many of these different voices and as many of these different perspectives on the war as I could possibly find. I mean, you know, another unwritten version of this book would be 3 times as long because there's so many stories that I wasn't able to tell, but I really tried to find as much balance as I could. And again, I mean, it was a juggling act. It took 8 years to finish it, but you know, I think I feel okay about where it ended up.
And just out of curiosity, when you are researching and taking that information, are you kind of allowing it yourself to kind of marinate in all that information, and then you go to the page without, you know, copious notes? Or did you have all this information that you're trying to embed into the book?
I mean, it's hard to answer specifically either of those options, but what I'll say is that, you know, to write a story like this that's taking place in a country that you know, less than a decade earlier had gone through, you know, a 12-year-long atrocity. I mean, you know, everyone in the world now is familiar with lockdown, right? We've spent the last 3 months barely leaving our houses. Well, that was what life was like for a lot of Peruvians for like 12 years. I mean, they didn't leave the house because there was open warfare in the streets between the government and these radical groups. You know, there were assassinations in broad daylight, there were kidnappings, there were military checkpoints on busy intersections in like wealthy neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods. They had, you know, Apache helicopters flying over the slums, and you know, and troops coming in, or counterterrorism forces breaking up peaceful demonstrations with live ammunition. So, you know, to think about a country that's gone through a trauma like that and to set a story in the years immediately afterwards, there's just no way to responsibly write that story that isn't constantly sort of haunted by the hangover from this trauma. I mean, the kind of national PTSD that the country was experiencing, and that in many ways is still experiencing, even though we're 25, almost 30 years removed. those events. And so, you know, I found maybe conveniently that I can't have a character, whether it's Leonora Gelb, the activist and wannabe revolutionary, or Andres, this other narrator who's just in Peru kind of, you know, to make himself happy and not to do anything for anybody but himself. It's impossible to walk around the streets or talk to Peruvians without these things coming up, without them being referenced. And so just thinking in terms of organic scenes and organic motivations for all of the characters, like it's always there. It was always there. And so, you know, I had a big compendium of research and books and notes and charts and a whole banker's box full of printouts that I could go to at any time. And usually it was just the story or the scene I was writing telling me, okay, you know, this needs to be worked into the scene because how could it not, right?
Right. Well, that might be a nice transition into one of the questions we have, Andrew, because it kind of relates to Andres and his political self. Do you see that one in the corner?
I do see it. And were we going to have Oscar kind of voice these over like Don Pardo? Or?
Right.
It's my disembodied voice.
Yes.
This is from Alyssa. She says, I really relate to Andres. Do you think your character Andres would be any different had he lived through the current state of the U.S. before heading to Peru? That's a hard question and an interesting question. Andres is telling the story 10 years later, so it's 2008 when he's researching the story of Leonora Gelb. And one of the reasons he lives in Peru is because he's left the U.S. in the wake of the Second Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq, the ongoing war in Afghanistan, and especially the revelations of the detainee abuses at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq in 2005 was when that story broke. And he's just kind of left in disgust with the Bush administration, the Patriot Act, the kind of jingoistic post 9/11 politics that we were all living through at the time. He considers that to be a political act rather than just a fundamentally self-dealing act. And so what I would say, you know, would he be any different if he were living through the current state of the US before heading to Peru? I mean, you know, this might sound a little churlish or maybe overstated, but I don't think there's really that much difference between the current state of the US and the state of the US in the mid-2000s when we were launching these wars and passing things like the Patriot Act, you know, and conducting domestic spying and managing black sites, the CIA managing black sites all over the world where we could take prisoners to third countries and torture them because it wasn't, you know, technically US soil or US personnel doing it. God knows, you know, the Camp X-ray at Guantanamo Bay, which has been open now for 18 years. Do we ever talk about closing that down anymore? We don't. I mean, we've come to accept things like torture, like surveillance. We've come to accept, you know, from the Bush administration, all through the Obama administration, he does not get a pass. And now through the Trump administration, to accept things like flying unmanned aircraft, you know, 20, 30,000 feet above civilian populations in parts of the world that most Americans can't find on a map, and firing missiles at them randomly, you know, killing dozens of civilians, and it doesn't even make the news anymore. So one of the things that I wanted to get into with this novel, both in the character of Leo, who explicitly has these revolutionary motivations, and in the character of Andres, who really just wants to go to another country to reinvent himself and have a good time because he can't stand being an American anymore, is the way that Americans look at the rest of the world as this kind of backdrop for either their own personal dramas or their own ideological desires, the ways that we send, you know, young people, whether they're in uniform or not, to go and export democracy or demand certain kind of economic or political changes, or even just, you know, in the great tradition of American expatriate novels, to go and have a great time and not really think too much about what these places are, what their history is, what the lives of people who live there are like. I mean, if you think about The Sun Also Rises as a classic expat novel, a novel that I love, or even something, you know, more recent like Ben Lerner's Leaving the Atocha Station. I mean, how much attention
do these books really pay to the realities of the people of the host countries? They are about Americans and their own sort of inner emotional journeys, and they just don't really give a damn about Spaniards or French people or, you know, anybody who are just this kind of wallpaper for their own personal dramas. And that to me feels wrapped up with exactly this nonsense about exporting democracy and, you know, making the world safe for capitalism that we, you know, have always engaged in this country, certainly for the last 150 years. The George W. Bush administration did it, the Obama administration did it, the Trump administration's doing it, albeit far less competently, which I guess is good for somebody somewhere. So I don't really make that much of a distinction.
Well, and it, like the passage that you read was a great example of that. I mean, you know, if that was happening in 2008, there's not much difference than what's happening, you know, outside our doors right now.
Right, exactly. So we've got a few minutes left. If there are any other questions, people can type them into Facebook. But I wanted to ask you, Melanie, we talked about a kind of similarity in our novel, which is that that both books have these protagonists who are in this kind of outright psychological rebellion against the worlds that they came from. You know, Leonora has grown up in this very, very comfortable, privileged white suburb of New York. She's gone to Stanford University, and she is really just intent on putting distance between herself and that world and going somewhere where she can, quote unquote, make a difference. Simran was raised in this fairly authoritative, you know, like you said, Eastern-oriented commune in Northern California, and she, as an adult, wants to be the opposite of that and to raise her child in the opposite of that. So I wanted to think about your own thinking towards that, whether that has a kind of personal resonance for you. I mean, I'll cop to it having a very personal resonance for me, but maybe you could talk about how that comes about for you in building these characters and their motives.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it two ways for me. I mean, one is, yes, like no matter what we experience in childhood, from like 100% good to 100% bad, I think we're all rebelling against something that we found prickling or affecting in a way that seems negative. So I think that I definitely have that kind of impulse to think about, you know, how I was raised, and then bristle against some of that, both in my own fiction and in how I raise my kids. And I think also the same thing happens though in the world that we're living in now, you know, like just thinking about like devices and media, like how much are we going to go all the way and say, oh, my child will, you know, be raised in this Waldorf environment, which will have no devices, or I'm not going to go down that path at all, just give them all access and allow them to have autonomy. And so I think that balance between trying to figure out what the right thing to do is really powerful, both for me as a writer, but for me as a mother as well. And so, yeah, I was like super interested in that. And ultimately come to this conclusion that, you know, we all do the best we can, and we're all going to fuck it up in some way. And, you know, that our kids are going to grow up to have their own things to bristle against. But hopefully maybe we do it better, which is why I kind of, I mean, obviously, if you haven't read the book, then you know, if people here haven't read the book yet, there's a little section at the end, which is really different from the rest of the entire book. But that little moment was important to me because you see one of the children from the present of the novel grown up and able to maybe see her mom more three-dimensionally than anybody else in the novel has, like able to see her flaws, but also her, you know, what she's done well. And that, I think I probably have a little bit of projection in there about hoping what my kids will be able to do when they grow up, to see, you know, the complexity of what it means to raise a child, and like that we're all, or that they can see that I'm hopefully doing the best that I can. So that, adding that on there was important for me too.
I love that last side. I mean, it's you know, properly like a coda, I think.
Right. Yeah.
And it's just, I mean, it is it is this kind of radical tonal shift from the rest of the novel, but it also just figures beautifully in. It's one of those kinds of sections where you don't understand until you're reading it that you couldn't have left the novel without having visited this place and this particular emotional landscape. So yeah, I love that section. And I think that's a pretty good place to leave it. I want to thank Melanie, and really, I can't recommend Meadowlark strongly enough. Please think about buying it. And if you're going to buy it from the Booksmith. Evan's back to kind of wrap things up, but just thanks everybody who tuned in today. And remember, I think Evan's going to tell you again about where your money might go if you buy one of these books this week. So thanks again to Oscar Villalon from Ziziva. Thanks to the Booksmith. Thanks to Melanie, and back to Evan Karp.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Melanie. This has been a great conversation, and it's been lovely to have you both here with us today. And thanks, Oscar, as always, for your skillful moderation, disembodied or not.
Disembodied is the way to go.
I agree wholeheartedly. Thank you all for joining us. And as Andrew said, the books are available from Booksmith. The Meadowlark by Melanie Abrams, The Gringa by Andrew Altschul. If you buy copies this week, we'll all make a donation to the protest and COVID-19 emergency relief fund. I hope we can all gather in person sometime soon. In the meanwhile, please take care, stay well, and fight like hell. Thank you all. See you soon. Take care.